on behalf of the City of Burlington and the Department of Recreation and Parks and the Paramount Theater, we are just tickled to death to have you folks with us tonight. It is not true that I have seen over half of the history of this town, but Walter has. And what we will do is we'll have a bit of presentation for about, I think we said about an hour, take a little, give you a chance to stretch your legs, get a sip of water. We'll come back and finish up, and then have a question and answer session afterwards. And if we don't know the answer, we'll make something up. I assure you. It may not be correct, but it'll be entertaining. And so, Walter, take it away.
Well, what we would like to do in the next 90 minutes or so is to give you a history of Burlington from the beginning to the present day. Obviously, we can't go into any great detail in such a short amount of time, so we're only going to touch on the highlights. And if there's something more you would like to learn about, we can try to schedule a future session like this to cover that topic more thoroughly. One thing we both learned over the years is that few people know anything about Burlington's history. Most people know it had something to do with the railroad and textile and hosiery, but that's about it. It's not surprising because most old records and copies of newspapers prior to 1930 were lost, burned, or otherwise destroyed. And no one has ever written a good, comprehensive history of Burlington either, although I'm working on one. And local history doesn't seem to be taught in schools anymore like it once was. So what we want to do here tonight is to explain to you how Burlington came to be and what has happened here since people have been living in this area. We hope we will both enlighten and surprise you.
No one came to what is now Burlington and said, well, this looks like a great place to build a town. Burlington is where it is solely because of its particular location and its existence to the decision of one individual named Walter Gwynn, who never lived here and based his decision solely upon location. So we'll talk about location first, and we'll talk about Mr. Gwynn later. As strange as it may sound, Burlington owes its existence to a plains buffalo who one day, many thousands of years ago, led his herd on a migration from what is now Virginia through North Carolina's Piedmont, probably in search of new grazing land. That original herd entered what is North Carolina now, near present-day Henderson, and traveled in a southwesterly direction until it reached the Eno River. Then, probably to avoid the Cane Creek Mountains, it turned due west for about 25 miles before crossing Haw River at either the present town of Haw River or the present town of Swepsonville, and resumed its southwesterly path. Now, since the buffalo is one of the largest land animals in North America, averaging about 6 feet in height and averaging over a ton in weight, buffalo also, since they travel in herds numbering in the tens of thousands, and since buffaloes are grazers, they've left a big wide path devoid of vegetation wherever they go. Now, over the ensuing centuries, the first herd's path was followed by thousands more. And although some of them branched off the original path a little bit here and a little bit there, they generally followed the same route. It was kept clear since there were still buffalo in this area in the beginning of the 18th century, with the last one being spotted in 1758.
When the first humans appeared, they easily tracked the buffalo for hunting purposes by following their clearly marked migratory paths. These humans soon found the old paths to be ideal trails for foot traffic as well, since animals always take the path of least resistance. In other words, they prefer to stay on flat land and cross rivers at natural fords where the water is not too deep and the current is not too swift. And there were always sources of potable water near the trails at regular intervals. By the way, this is a section of the actual buffalo trading path here in Alamance County. The original inhabitants of the Piedmont, usually called natives or Indians, were hunter-gatherers and somewhat migratory, staying in one place only as long as the land on which they were living remained fertile and game was plentiful, and their neighbors peaceful. They preferred to settle along rivers, not only because they would have had access to a permanent water supply, but because the canoe was the fastest way of travel. Since the rivers of present-day Alamance County are not generally navigable north of what is now Swepsonville, all native settlements discovered to date have been along Haw River south of there. In other words, while natives hunted here in what's now Burlington, I base this on arrowheads found in and around the town over the past 200 years, no evidence has been found yet that anyone ever lived here prior to the 18th century.
Alamance County's only known native inhabitants were members of the Sissepaha tribe, but little is known about them due to the fact that they were first encountered by the early Spanish explorers in what is now South Carolina, and they probably didn't arrive here until sometime in the 16th century and had all but disappeared into the second decade of the 18th century. In fact, the Piedmont was vacated by nearly all of its native inhabitants during the Tuscarora War from 1710 to 1715. Some, including the Tuscarora, went north to join the Iroquois, while others of Siouan origin went southwest to join the Catawba tribe between Charlotte and Salisbury.
When Europeans began settling what is now the United States in the early 17th century, they hugged the coastal areas for the next 100 years or so to give them easy access to the ocean. This was because most of the early settlers depended upon European trade for their livelihoods. They shipped what they grew or produced to Europe in return for finished goods that they needed or wanted but were not produced here. Thus, even when settlers began venturing inland in large numbers around the beginning of the 18th century, usually in search of more fertile and inexpensive land for growing money crops such as tobacco, they tended to do so along large navigable rivers such as Virginia's James River, which is pictured here. Large navigable rivers were the superhighways of colonial days. But because North Carolina lacks any truly navigable rivers west of the fall line, that is, west of Raleigh, its interior, including the Piedmont and the western parts of the colony, remained largely uninhabited until about the middle of the 18th century. This is Haw River, by the way.
About the only ones who regularly ventured into North Carolina's interior were explorers and traders, and both made great use of the old Buffalo Path that ran through the present-day Alamance County, which soon became known as the Great Indian Trading Path. It was the primary route used by Virginia traders operating out of what is now present-day Petersburg, called Fort Henry back then, who established a lucrative trade with the Catawba tribe. And of course, we mentioned they were down in the Salisbury-Charlotte area. But they just passed through Alamance County and never really settled here. The first settlers in what is now Alamance County can best be described as illegal and undocumented immigrants. This is because the area was owned by the Carteret family, and John Carteret, the second Earl Granville, one of the 8 Lord Proprietors who received the Carolina colony as a reward from King Charles II in 1663, didn't officially open his share of the colony till settlement to 1743. But while no normal colonist wanted to live here because it was so isolated from everything, there was a certain group who did. Those who wished to avoid civilization.
When England established its first permanent American colony at Jamestown, Virginia in 1607, the people who came to live there were mostly reputable, law-abiding, God-fearing, and hard-working. But there were some who came to Virginia who were the exact opposite. A great many of them were criminals who came to America to avoid punishment or were exiled here to get them out of England. But they all had several things in common. They resented authority, they didn't care much for others, and they avoided responsibility. The vast majority also avoided hard work. At the time, they were referred to as white trash, and that term continues to be used to this day. Upon arrival at Jamestown, the white trash element promptly fled to the fringes of the Jamestown colony to get as far away from everyone as they could. While a few became self-sufficient and wanted nothing to do with anyone, most wanted to maintain at least some contact with their fellow Englishmen because they needed access to such things as firearms, cloth, gunpowder, and alcohol. To acquire these things, they usually established a clandestine and illegal commerce with the various tribes, trading furs for weapons and whiskey.
As the Virginia colony moved west in the early 17th century, all the way to the Blue Ridge Mountains, quite a few of those who lived on the fringes of civilization there began moving south into North Carolina's interior. Now, they followed the great Indian trading path, formerly known as the Buffalo Boulevard, and settled along in order to continue their illicit trade with the Indians and the English. The white trash element was supplemented by others who generally did not share the same unsavory reputation, but nevertheless wanted to avoid the authorities. These were mostly runaway indentured servants, debtors, runaway husbands, wives, or children, sailors jumping ship, and escaped slaves.
The Piedmont had been vacated by nearly all of its native inhabitants following the Tuscarora War, so it was both a safe and isolated area. When William Byrd II, pictured here, of Virginia, led an expedition to survey the border between Virginia and North Carolina in 1728 through 33, he reported in the journal he kept that there were white people living in what is now Alamance County, specifically in the Hawfields area. Even though they were not here legally, and there's no record of them because they didn't legally own the land on which they were living, and most didn't intend on staying long either.
Because the Piedmont region and western parts of North Carolina lacked any navigable rivers, and because the closest ports from which a ship to ship goods to Europe were located at Cross Creek, now Fayetteville, or Fort Henry, as we mentioned, Petersburg, no one interested in commerce was willing to live in such a remote area as this. But all that changed around mid-century. The motivating factor was cheap land, but even cheap land wasn't appealing enough to anyone except those willing to live in relative isolation. By the middle of the 18th century, however, there were enough people in this area to populate the Piedmont. What changed was the vast influx of immigrants from Europe, mostly from Scotland and Ireland and what is now Germany, starting around the second decade of the 18th century. It was caused by overcrowding and poor economic conditions more than anything else, and encouraged by the policies of Queen Anne and King George I, who invited them to settle in Britain's American colonies.
Philadelphia was the primary port of entry for most of these immigrants. Most settled initially in Pennsylvania, but problems soon arose. Pennsylvania was founded by William Penn in 1682 as a haven for English Quakers, including my ancestors, who had been severely persecuted in England for their religious beliefs. They were soon joined in Pennsylvania by a number of German Protestants who were being overcrowded in the upper Rhine regions and to a lesser extent were tired of living on a perpetual battlefield and being victimized by Catholic France and other Catholic German states. William Penn welcomed them to Pennsylvania because his mother was German.
The Quakers and the Germans got along well with each other. Both groups were quiet, law-abiding, and hard-working. The third group, the Scots, usually called Scots-Irish, were different, however. The Scots, my people, had been the thorn in England's side for hundreds of years and were in constant rebellion against English rule. Even though King James I was a Scotsman, he exiled numbers of his countrymen to Ireland, which was also in constant rebellion. Large parts of Northern Ireland were depopulated by warfare between England and Ireland in the 16th century, so King James sent most of them there to take over abandoned estates. But Protestant Scots found themselves almost as unwelcome in Catholic Ireland as the English. An attempted coup by the Scottish rebels against the newly crowned King George I in 1715, followed by a sudden economic downturn in Northern Ireland, resulted in large numbers of Scots from both Scotland and Ireland coming to Pennsylvania.
The new Scottish immigrants were not very neighborly to their German and English Quaker neighbors. They were quarrelsome and resented authority, and many drank heavily. That was mostly my family. Land quickly became scarce, which drove up prices. William Penn always purchased land from the tribes in Pennsylvania in order to keep the peace with them, and he also kept a wide buffer zone between the natives and the whites in order to avoid any potential conflicts. But when he died in 1718, his heirs quit purchasing land. When prices began to rise due to the shortage of legally available land, the Scots simply moved into the areas that had not been purchased yet, which antagonized the Indians. Pretty soon everybody wanted out of Pennsylvania. The Quakers and Germans wanted to get away from the Scots, and the Scots wanted good, cheap land. Going north was not really an option because neither New York or New England wanted any of the three groups. Going south was their only choice, but Maryland was out because it was a Catholic colony and didn't welcome Protestants. Virginia required its residents to be members of the Church of England. So North Carolina, with its abundance of cheap land, recently opened for settlement by John Carteret, the second Earl Granville, was the closest and most appealing. Neither the Scots nor the Germans nor the Quakers were concerned about living on what was then the frontier because the closest hostile Indians around here were the Cherokees, and they were many miles to the west. They also didn't mind the fact that they were far removed from access to ports either because they were all nearly subsistence farmers. That is, they grew crops only to feed their families and livestock and really didn't need to trade with anyone.
When these Pennsylvania transplants finally began to arrive here in Piedmont, North Carolina, in large numbers around 1750, they traveled by foot, and they used yet another old buffalo trail as their primary route here, known as the Great Philadelphia Wagon Road. Now, it stretched from Philadelphia all the way to Augusta, Georgia. It ran through Virginia's Shenandoah Valley and then turned south, coming into North Carolina near present-day Winston-Salem and continuing down to the Salisbury-Charlotte area and then on to South Carolina and Georgia. When these three groups arrived in the Piedmont, they tended to form their own homogeneous groups and settled far away from the others as possible. For example, in what is now North Carolina, the Germans settled west of Haw River, the Scots settled east of Haw River, and the Quakers settled in the southern part of the county along Cane Creek. The extreme northern part of the county was largely settled by tobacco planters from Virginia, primarily of English descent.
All of the first white inhabitants in Alamance County selected sites to settle as close to a river as they could. This was because the land was more fertile and because it gave them easy access to abundant supplies of water for personal and animal use and for powering grist mills to grind grain. The area where Burlington and Graham is now located was not among the prime parcels of real estate available for settlement because there were no rivers or even large streams. Consequently, it remained largely unoccupied until the outbreak of the French and Indian War in 1754. Although Virginia required all residents to be members of the Church of England, it allowed a few Germans to live along its western border to serve as a buffer between the hostile tribes in the Ohio Valley west of the Blue Ridge and its citizens in the interior. Among these were several families of German miners who had been imported a generation before as indentured servants, had worked off their passage and settled in the area west of Fredericksburg. These Germans, along with a few of their English in-laws, decided to head for safer grounds in North Carolina when the war broke out and traveled down the Great Philadelphia Wagon Road to join the large German community already living here west of Haw River. Since most of the good land had been scooped up by the first German immigrants several years before, they chose several tracts consisting of what is now Burlington. Perhaps the best known member of this group was Michael Holt, who lived along what is now East Webb Avenue near the Williamson Street intersection.
The two most important settlements in the Piedmont in colonial North Carolina were Hillsborough, the county seat of the once very large Orange County, located along the Great Indian Trading Path, and Salisbury, located at the intersection of the Great Indian Trading Path and the Great Philadelphia Wagon Road. There was a lot of traffic between Salisbury and Hillsborough, since those wishing to register their property had to travel all the way to Hillsborough to do so. Among those was a young Daniel Boone.
That was Fess Parker, by the way. As Daniel Boone, not as Davy Crockett. Boone's passage through what is now Burlington was commemorated for several years by a monument at the intersection of Trollinger Street and West Webb Avenue. And that is it. But so many cars ran into it that Mayor Horner ordered it removed, and it was never replaced. And no, the Boones buried in Browns Chapel Cemetery up there on West Davis Street are not related to Daniel. They were German Boones, spelled B-U-H-N originally, and Daniel was of English Quaker stock. They were just pronounced the same. Although most people living in what is now Burlington were subsistence farmers, the little German community's location along the old Buffalo Trail, which was by then being called the Hillsborough-Salisbury Road, made it an ideal place for taverns and inns and blacksmith shops and stores to service travelers, and several sprang up here. One of the best known was the O'Neill Stagecoach Inn, where the Askew Dog Park is today. It was owned and operated by William O'Neill, whose mother, Margaret Clark, was German. His older sister was married to Michael Holt.
Although generally commemorated here locally, the Regulator Rebellion, which culminated in the Battle of Alamance in 1771, was not the first battle of the American Revolution, as some call it, and it had little impact on the residents of what is now Burlington. It was merely an uprising by a group of Piedmont farmers, mostly from Randolph County, against corrupt government practices. Indeed, many former regulators sided with Britain during the American Revolution. What is now Burlington was greatly impacted by the American Revolution, however, although not until relatively late in the rebellion. Stalemated in the northern colonies by 1779, Great Britain changed its tactics in 1780 and decided to invade the three southernmost colonies, split them from the rest, since the people in Georgia and the two Carolinas were mostly loyalist or neutral. Locally, nearly everyone followed that sentiment, although there were a few that supported the Patriot cause, including William O'Neill, who became a local leader. However, his heavy-handed recruiting tactics made many enemies of his neighbors.
Following the crushing defeat inflicted upon the Continental Army of the South at the Battle of Camden, South Carolina in 1780, British troops under the command of General Cornwallis, pictured here, chased General Nathaniel Greene, the commander of the new Continental Army of the South, out of South Carolina, across North Carolina, and into Virginia during the winter of 1780-81. Greene luckily escaped across Dan River at what is now the town of South Boston and took all of the boats for miles around him. So Cornwallis, his men exhausted and out of supplies, decided not to pursue. Instead, Cornwallis came south to Hillsborough to get resupplied and to add troops to replace those he had lost. Cornwallis sent out a request for all local loyalists in Orange County to join him, and a large group led by Dr. John Pyle responded. Pyle said that he would gather his men on Michael Holt II's plantation, which used to be near the present-day intersection of Maple Avenue and Anthony Street, and requested a contingent of British cavalry to escort him and his men safely to Hillsborough.
Cornwallis dispatched his most trusted subordinate, Colonel Bannister Tarleton, to find Pyle and bring him back. Tarleton proceeded west from Hillsborough and crossed into what is now Burlington at Trollinger's Ford, now the town of Haw River. He proceeded down what is now North Church Street, Fisher Street, West Webb Avenue, and then Tarleton Avenue, South Mebane Street, and then Alamance Road, which was then all a part of the Hillsborough-Salisbury Road. Tarleton reported in his journal that he and his men were attacked by small bands of local patriots along the way, with one of these skirmishes possibly occurring along Tarleton Avenue near the West Davis Street intersection. About 90 years ago, by the way, when that area was being developed, a number of large caliber musket balls were found, and an officer's sword was found nearby some years later. Now, Tarleton stopped to ask directions to Michael Holt II's plantation, but he found that everyone spoke only German, and he couldn't understand them, so he headed in the wrong direction. As night approached, he decided to return to the O'Neill Inn and appropriated as his headquarters for the night. His men camped in what is now Pine Hill Cemetery.
Meanwhile, General Greene dispatched a group of Patriot cavalrymen to head south and keep his eyes on Tarleton. Led by Colonel Henry, Light Horse Harry, as he was called, Lee, the father of future Confederate General Robert E. Lee, and including the father of future Confederate General Joseph Johnston, Lee arrived in what is now Alamance County at the same time Tarleton did. But he crossed Hall River at the Swepsonville Ford, south of Trollinger's Ford, and proceeded east. Colonel Pyle had been told to follow the men in green uniforms, which is what the British cavalrymen also wore at the time. What Pyle didn't know, however, was that Colonel Lee's men, as you can see the green there, wore the green. So when Lee's men showed up before Tarleton got there, the unsuspecting loyalists thought they were in friendly hands. Their subsequent slaughter was the result. And they're all still buried there on the same spot today. It's all private property, and they don't allow people there, but they're two huge mounds where the bodies are buried. Immediately following what became known as Pyle's Massacre, Lee got word that Tarleton was 2 miles away at O'Neill's Stagecoach Inn and set out to do battle with him. At about the same time, Tarleton got word that Lee was nearby and prepared to do the same. A significant Revolutionary War battle probably would have taken place in Burlington that evening had it not been for the timely approach of a dispatch rider from Lord Cornwallis, who ordered Tarleton to get back to Hillsborough at that instant. When Lee then arrived at O'Neill's plantation or inn at dawn, he found Tarleton and his men gone. However, they had bayoneted a teenage boy whose body was found on what is now South Mebane Street. He may have been spying on the British, or he may just have been curious, but the British evidently thought he was a spy.
When Tarleton arrived back in Hillsborough, he found out that Cornwallis had heard Greene's army was on the move and headed back into North Carolina, somewhere near present-day Reidsville. So he decided to intercept him, despite the fact that his reinforcements had been wiped out and the rest of them scared off. So Tarleton again made a trip back into what is now Burlington, along with his commanding officer and the rest of the British Army. Instead of stopping at O'Neill's Inn or any other place near downtown Burlington, Cornwallis kept going west until he arrived at Clapp's Mill, the site of which is now under Lake McIntosh. The British were being watched by Harry Lee and some of the Continental Army troops camped in and around what is now Burlington's Springwood Park. The two groups met and skirmished with each other at what has been known as the Battle of Clapp's Mill. An enraged Cornwallis set out in pursuit, and several more skirmishes were fought just north of Gibsonville. A short time later, Cornwallis and Greene met in the fateful Battle of Guilford Courthouse, just north of Greensboro.
Although the British won the battle, Cornwallis failed in destroying the Continental Army of the South, which was his main goal. Moreover, he lost so many men that he was forced to retreat all the way to the port of Wilmington, where he could be resupplied and receive replacements. It was on his way to Wilmington that Cornwallis passed through the Cane Creek community. The British Army's one-night stay there has received all of the press since then, but their more significant presence in what is now Burlington, for some reason, has been largely forgotten or ignored. After arriving in Wilmington, Cornwallis decided to go to Virginia and punish that colony for aiding Greene's army. At first, all went well, and Tarleton came within a whisker of capturing Governor Thomas Jefferson at his Monticello home. But in October, just 8 months after he was in Burlington, Cornwallis's army was trapped, and he was forced to surrender. The Battle of Yorktown is considered to be the end of the American Revolution, but it actually dragged on till 1783 when the final peace treaty was signed and the British left. But most of the fighting that took place in Alamance County occurred during that time. However, it was not between the British and the Americans, but between the Loyalists and the Patriots. And it was very brutal and nasty. When it was all over, however, nearly all of the Loyalists and neutrals suddenly announced they'd been patriots all along.
During the more than 50 years following the American Revolution, practically nothing happened in what is now Burlington, except that the Germans quit using the language in their schools and churches and started speaking English. They also anglicized the spelling of their surnames. Drollinger, D-R-O-L-I-N-G-R, became Trollinger. Dickel, D-I-C-K-E-L, became Tickle. Lau, L-A-U, became Lau, L-O-W-E. Lang, L-A-N-G, became Long. Scharf became Sharp. Hofheinz became Huffines, and so on. By the end of the 19th century, many of these German families, especially the well-to-do ones, began to announce that their ancestors had actually been English noblemen. But even Britain's current royal family likes to hide the fact that they're more German than English.
The first event worthy of mentioning in Alamance County was the birth of the textile mill. Due to a paucity of records, however, exactly which mill was first to begin operations is not really known. The best claimant seems to be the Cane Creek factory started by William and Peter Stout. It was constructed as early as 1830 or as late as 1835. The second mill was the High Falls Manufacturing Company in what is now Hopedale. Construction was begun by John Trollinger in 1832, but the mill was apparently not in operation until sometime between 1837 and 1840 due to a depression in the country during those years. The third and best known is the one pictured here, is Alamance Factory, started by Edwin Michael Holt, the great-grandson of Michael Holt, the German immigrant, in what is now the village of Alamance in 1837. All of these mills were water-powered. Over the next 3 decades, several other textile mills were constructed along the streams and rivers of Alamance County. Most failed for one reason or another, but Edwin M. Holt's mills prospered, chiefly because it began making a plaid cotton fabric, which was in high demand. And this is an example of the Alamance plaids that were originally made. The biggest problem all of these mills faced, however, was the market for the cotton yarn and fabric that they produced was primarily local, since there was no good or easy way to get their products to market. In other words, navigable rivers were required for transportation, but the short, swift-moving streams that we have here in Alamance County were just perfect for running the cotton mills.
The most significant development in the history of Piedmont, North Carolina, was the North Carolina Railroad, which was chartered in 1849, the same year that Alamance County was split from the western half of Orange County, and funded partly by the state and partly by private stockholders. For the first time in its more than 250-year history, the Piedmont was connected to the eastern part of the state, and from there to the rest of the country. People could travel more easily and also ship their goods to distant markets throughout the country via connecting routes. The North Carolina Railroad was most important locally, however, because without it, Burlington would not exist. It was one of the few towns anywhere to owe its existence solely to a railroad. Survey work on the North Carolina Railroad's route, which was to connect Goldsboro to Charlotte, began shortly after the company was formed in 1850. Not surprisingly, the surveyors found that the old Buffalo migration routes, there's that Buffalo again, the section of the Great Indian trading path between Durham and Charlotte, was most suitable. It wasn't the shortest route, but it was the flattest. And flat was important because the locomotives in use at the time were not powerful enough to pull a train up a steep grade.
Once the route was established, the next 3 years were spent securing rights of way, grading the track bed, and building bridges across rivers and streams. In 1853, however, when Walter Gwynn became the railroad's chief construction engineer, he proposed a single repair and maintenance facility for the line, and that it should be located at the midway point of the 223-mile route, rather than having separate facilities in both Goldsboro and Charlotte. The exact halfway point lies in what is now Glen Raven, but the ground there was found to be too swampy and thus unsuitable. Now I know why all the old people always call Glen Raven Frogtown. It was then decided to go west 2 miles and east 2 miles and locate the shops in the new county seat of Graham. But Graham didn't want the shops because it was feared that the noise would interfere with court business. It was at this point that Ben Trollinger, a member of the railroad's board of directors and son of John Trollinger, who had established the cotton mill at Hopedale, proposed that the shops be established on a tract of land he had acquired between Glenraven and Graham. Now, contrary to most of the accounts and histories of Burlington that have been written so far, Ben Trollinger didn't own any of the land he offered the railroad for its shops. Nor did he offer to give the land to the railroad. Instead, he charged the railroad 5 times what the going rate for farmland was in Alamance County at the time. And it was $2 an acre. He charged 10.
After Graham rejected the shops, concern arose that locating them in an established town might result in the town later passing restrictive ordinances against the railroad and its facilities. There was also some concern that railroad employees might be lured into the town's bars, gambling establishments, and, dare I say it, houses of ill repute. So, while the repair and maintenance facilities would occupy only about 15 acres of land, the railroad decided to acquire 640 acres, or 1 square mile, to establish a suitable buffer zone around the shops. The land Ben Trollinger offered, a little over 631 acres in size, bisected by the railroad tracks. The shops could be located at almost the exact center, and it was only 1 mile from the location recommended by Chief Engineer Gwynn. The railroad jumped at the offer, although it sparked a great deal of controversy at the time. Meanwhile, work on the line itself progressed rapidly. Track was laid through Alamance County in 1855, with the section between Haw River and Gibsonville completed in October. The first train began running between Goldsboro and Charlotte January 29th, 1856. The first passenger from what is now Burlington was Sarah Jane Turrentine, who grew up in the old O'Neill Stagecoach Inn that her family had acquired.
Once the land for the maintenance and repair facilities had been acquired, Chief Engineer Gwynn drew up plans for the buildings to be located there. The 2 primary structures were the engine shop. By the way, this was when the shops had gone out of business and Virginia Bridge and Iron had acquired the old buildings to build bridges. The second primary structure behind it here, it was known as the carpenter shop. That's where the rolling stock, the box cars, and passenger cars could be manufactured. The engine shop was used to service locomotives. In addition, there were several smaller buildings to house such things as a blacksmith shop, a foundry, and a roundhouse where locomotives could be stored temporarily awaiting repair. All but the roundhouse were constructed of brick. And when completed, the engine and carpenter shops were the largest buildings in the state. A few other non-shop buildings were also constructed at the same time. Flanking the shops were small houses for supervisory employees and a boarding house for others. By the way, this is Brick Row. It was just to the east of where the Amtrak depot is now. All of these houses survived until they were torn down in 1970.
A 2-story brick office building was erected across the tracks from the shops, believe it or not, where the parking lot is at the Paramount Theater. To the east of this, between present-day Spring Street and Lexington Avenue, were 2-story brick homes for the president and vice president of the North Carolina Railroad. The shops themselves were completed and in full operation within a year after the line had opened. The remaining buildings were completed later in 1857. Interestingly, although a passenger depot directly in front of the engine house was depicted on Walter Gwynn's original design for the shops, no one was ever built. It is suspected that it was because there was no town nearby and thus no passengers, or very few, for service.
The last building constructed by the North Carolina Railroad in the complex known as Company's Repair Shops, later shortened simply to Company Shops, was a large two-story brick hotel. It was located on the same side of the tracks as the railroad's office building, and its site would be just to the west of the present Main Street crossing. West Webb Avenue cuts right through the middle of where this building used to be. The hotel, which was always referred to as Railroad Hotel, was an afterthought and constructed at the insistence of the North Carolina Railroad's new president, Charles Fisher, for two primary reasons. First, when Ben Trollinger sold the land to the shops to the railroad, he extracted a major concession. He had a hotel on land he owned in the town of Haw River and made the railroad agree to allow passenger trains to stop there for their meals, which was a huge source of revenue for him. This concession especially disturbed the North Carolina Railroad board member E.M. Holt, who was also Ben Trollinger's business rival. Fisher ordered the construction of a hotel at company shops in 1858. That in and of itself was not a bad idea, since there was no place for people visiting the place to stay. Plus, Fisher himself needed some place to stay when in company shops, because he chose to retain his residence in his native Salisbury and didn't use the large president's house built for him. Here he comes now. But Fisher went overboard and had a palace erected instead of a modest hotel, which enraged the North Carolina's Railroad's board of directors. They ordered the president, Fisher, not to spend another dime on the construction of any additional buildings, which prevented him from carrying out his plans to erect a business district, a church, and a school for railroad employees and their families.
Only one business was ever established in company shops prior to the war. It was a two-story frame general store owned by John M. Worth and operated by his cousin, Daniel Worth. It was located on the south side of the tracks between the railroad's office building and the president's home. And because no depot had been constructed, it served as the waiting area for passengers. A short time later, President Fisher allowed James G. Moore, one of the North Carolina Railroad's agents, to open a second store. Now, it was located where is now the intersection of East Front and South Main, where the building owned by the Burlington Brew Works is today. Fisher also allowed Moore to build a home, which he did at the site that is now Lexington Avenue, directly in front of Burlington's municipal building. Fisher also allowed the railroad's treasurer to build a private home on the north side of the tracks, just west of the shops. Despite its cost, the hotel proved to be a great success. Nancy Hilliard, who was famous throughout North Carolina for her boarding house at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, was coaxed out of retirement to run the hotel and its kitchen, and her food was considered to be the best along the entire Goldsboro to Charlotte route. When passenger trains began stopping at the Railroad Hotel instead of Ben Trollinger's Haw River house, it withered and died. He went bankrupt and was forced to sell his cotton mill in Haw River to E.M. Holt, who promptly turned it over to his son Thomas to operate.
The North Carolina Railroad's maintenance and repair facilities and company shops proved to be a great success. Because few in North Carolina knew the first thing about servicing locomotives or building passenger cars, many of the first employees were imported from other areas where railroads had been in operation longer, especially from the British Isles and states in the north, although some came from nearby Virginia and South Carolina, where the railroads had been operating since 1840. One of these people came from Prussia. His name was Charles Friedrich Rawhut, who came to the carpenter shop to carve the interiors of passenger cars. He lived in a little raw hut, no pun intended, on what is now East Moorhead Street, and this is actually a photograph of it. A large contingent of slaves was also utilized for work at the shops. Some were bought outright by the railroad, while others were rented from their owners. Among the latter was Spencer Thomas, pictured here, who was hired to work in the foundry. Scottish immigrant Thomas Robertson taught him how to work in metal, a skill he put to good use once he received his freedom in 1865. The paint was barely dry on Railroad Hotel when the issue of secession reared its ugly head. Although South Carolina and several other states in the Deep South carried through on their threats and left the Union shortly after Abraham Lincoln's election, it was not a popular issue in either Alamance County or North Carolina. But after Lincoln called for troops to put down the rebellion, and then when Virginia and Tennessee seceded, North Carolina reluctantly followed for fear that if it didn't, it would become a battlefield.
Many in the North and South, of course, thought the war would be over quickly, and they wanted to get in on the glory while they could. North Carolina Railroad President Charles Fisher was one of those, and he organized his own regiment, which became known as the 6th North Carolina Regiment of State Troops, later known as the Bloody Sixth. Colonel Fisher received the glory he was seeking, but he did not get to enjoy it, because he was shot through the head and killed during the first major battle of the war, the First Battle of Bull Run, or Manassas. Fisher is, of course, the namesake for Fisher Street and for Fort Fisher on the North Carolina coast. The North Carolina Railroad and its repair and maintenance facilities were of vital importance to the Confederacy throughout the war. The route was of critical importance in transporting men, munitions, and food from the Deep South to the Army of Northern Virginia, especially after Union forces invaded eastern North Carolina and threatened the railroad lines there.
The North Carolina Railroad was purely an intrastate line. It didn't connect with any lines out of state. And it was soon realized that a direct connection between the North Carolina Railroad's line and the Richmond and Danville Railroad's line was needed in the event the Eastern North Carolina Railroad lines were cut, which they eventually were. The shortest route to connect the North Carolina Railroad with the Richmond and Danville was between company shops and Danville, a distance of about 50 miles. But Confederate President Jefferson Davis personally intervened and vetoed this route for reasons unknown. He wanted the connection made at Greensboro instead of company shops. This decision would have a great post-war impact on the future of the North Carolina Railroad's repair and maintenance facilities, and hence on Burlington. By the way, Jefferson Davis was here in town in 1871. He slipped in one night, had dinner with President Smith just at the President's house, which was located just across Spring Street from the Paramount's back parking lot, and then slipped out. No one even knew he was here. By the way, Davis Street here in town is not named in the honor of Jefferson Davis. It's named in honor of North Carolina Railroad Director Dolphin Davis. Since the South lacked any factories for constructing locomotives, it was up to the skilled and resourceful employees who didn't leave North Carolina when North Carolina seceded to keep the existing locomotives repaired. The carpenter shop was kept busy repairing the rolling stock and building new boxcars to transport soldiers and supplies. Unfortunately, the North Carolina Railroad's equipment wore out quicker than the personnel at company shops could repair it.
Except for causing shortages of food and goods, the Civil War had relatively little impact on company shops until the very end of the conflict, because railroad workers were exempt from the draft. By early 1865, Union forces under the command of General William T. Sherman invaded North Carolina from the south. General Joseph Johnston's Army of Tennessee, the Confederacy's largest, was slowly pushed back until it halted at company shops in mid-April. Troops camped all over what is now downtown Burlington. Meanwhile, that spring, Union forces under General Ulysses S. Grant broke the stalemate in Virginia and forced Robert E. Lee and his men to retreat west.
Confederate President Jefferson Davis and his cabinet fled Richmond then and came to Greensboro. From there, Davis issued orders to Lee that he and his army were to follow him and join up with Johnston's army here in company shops. But Lee was cut off and forced to surrender at Appomattox. Davis ordered Johnston and his men to keep fighting. And for a while, it looked like the climactic battle of the Civil War was going to be fought right here in company shops. But Johnston decided to disobey orders and surrender. He addressed his men from a platform erected behind John M. Worth's store at what is now the intersection of East Webb Avenue and Spring Street. Told them all to go home. Johnston then proceeded to a farm east of Durham on a train engineered by local resident Will Turrentine and surrendered to Sherman. The Civil War was over. By the way, Johnston's father, as I mentioned earlier, had been here 84 years before when he was part of Lee's Legion and participated in Pyle's massacre.
Company Shops was occupied by Union forces after Johnston's surrender, and troops encamped at Charles Fisher's former parade ground off of what is now North Broad Street. The soldiers passed part of their time looking for valuables they heard Southerners had buried in the ground. One of these hunts was in a wooded lot surrounding the railroad office building that they located tens of thousands of dollars in $10 gold pieces. It had been buried there in 1862 when the Commerce Bank of New Bern fled the city before it was occupied by Union forces. It set up a small branch office in John M. Worth's store and thus became the first bank in town. But they had to hide the gold because the Confederate government required all banks to turn over their precious metals to the Treasury in Richmond. When the commanding general of Union forces in North Carolina heard of the gold found in Company Shops, he ordered it seized and brought to Raleigh. Most of it was recovered, but some of the men took it back to their campground and buried it under their tents, obviously hoping to come back later and retrieve it. Perhaps some did, but when the ground was being cleared for Burlington's first graded school on the site in 1901, so much of it was found that it sparked a mini gold rush in Burlington.
By the way, Dave also wrote a play about this several years ago called The Last Encampment that I was in here on this stage. The victorious North provided no aid, financial or otherwise, to anyone other than former slaves. So the South really didn't recover fully from the Civil War for many decades. The North Carolina Railroad struggled for 5 years to rebuild and repair the damage suffered during the war, but due to a lack of financial resources, was finally forced to lease its tracks to the Richmond and Danville Railroad for 99 years until 1969. The Richmond and Danville only wanted that portion of the line that extended from Greensboro to Charlotte so that it could establish a route directly from Richmond to Atlanta, and really didn't care for the portion of the line between Greensboro and Goldsboro. The Richmond and Danville also had its own repair and maintenance facility at Mechanicsville, Virginia, which caused another exodus of skilled workers from here before the anticipated shutdown of the facilities. But it turned out that fears of a shutdown were a little premature. While some jobs were eliminated, it was business as usual, at least for about the next decade and a half. And the Richmond and Danville even went so far as to complete the new brick roundhouse, on which construction had already started in 1864 but abandoned. That new brick roundhouse, which was completed in 1871, now serves as the local Amtrak station.
One of the worst effects of Reconstruction was its failure to properly address and control the societal upheaval caused by the freeing of millions of slaves across the South. In particular, white males bitterly resented the federal government's policies to help former slaves adjust to freedom by allowing them to vote, educating them, and giving them preferential treatment in hiring. They responded by forming secret groups that used fear, intimidation, and violence to prevent freedmen from assuming their rightful place in society. Although there were several different groups, even in Alamance County, they were all generically referred to as the Ku Klux Klan, or most simply, the Klan. The Klan's lynching of former Union soldier and Company Shops carpenter Wyatt Outlaw in Courthouse Square in Graham in February 1870, coupled with the murder of a Republican state legislator in Yanceyville that same year, prompted Republican Governor William W. Holden to declare Alamance and Caswell counties in a state of rebellion. He called out the state militia to restore order, but realizing that the regular militia would be unwilling to arrest and punish their own fellow citizens, he imported his own militia from the western part of the state and put them under the command of the infamous Colonel William Kirk.
Many of Kirk's men were undisciplined brutes, and his heavy-handed tactics, especially after arresting nearly 100 prominent men in Alamance County and confining them to a pen in company shops, provoked outrage all over the state. The result of what came to be called the Kirk-Holden War was that Kirk wound up being imprisoned. All the other men were freed. Governor Holden was removed from office, and eventually all Klansmen were pardoned by the new Democratic legislature. For the next 20 years, neither the Civil War nor Reconstruction was talked about much because people were simply ashamed and embarrassed by what had happened. Everyone just wanted to get on with their lives.
The North Carolina Railroad released its iron grip on company shops a bit following the Civil War by allowing people not associated with the railroad to move into company shops, to set up businesses, and to build homes. It also granted these people a form of self-government. However, the railroad still exercised a great deal of control regarding who it would allow to live and do business here, and it leased the land rather than sold it outright.
The North Carolina Railroad also commissioned a street plan for the new town. Nearly all the streets were named after men who had been directors of the North Carolina Railroad prior to 1866. Fisher, Gilmer, Webb, and Davis, just to name a few. Now, there were a few exceptions. Main Street, which ran south from the center of the engine house. Spring Street, which led to a natural spring at the Maple Avenue corner. And Church Street, which was named because of the small Baptist church established by the former slave Spencer Thomas, whose picture you saw a moment ago, who became a tinsmith and a minister when he was freed. Front Street was not named. It was simply a dirt path between Church and Spring Streets, and for years it was just known as Big Road. It was originally a shortcut for Methodist ministers traveling from Graham to Brown's Chapel on what is now West Davis Street, and was also called Methodist Path. It received its current name at some point prior to 1886, probably because it fronted the railroad shops. Although local citizens erected a small church and school building at the corner of what is now Church Street and West Davis Street following the war, it was soon appropriated by the Freedmen's Bureau and removed to what is now the corner of Vance Street and North Church Street to serve as a school building for the newly freed slaves.
A new church and school building called Union Church School was completed in 1869 just off Fisher Street, north of the railroad tracks. It was opened to all denominations, and most used it until they erected church buildings of their own. During the 20 years following the railroad's decision to allow outsiders to operate in company shops, the business district grew very slowly. Alex McAllister, John M. Worth's son-in-law, came to operate his store and displaced Daniel Worth, who had run it for nearly 10 years. Daniel Worth then went out and started his own store, which was actually a cooperative store, called simply Cooperative Store Number 1. It was behind the Railroad Hotel at what is now the corner of West Front and Main Streets, where the amphitheater is today. There were a few other short-lived general stores. When James G. Moore's health began to fail a few years prior to his death in 1879, Dr. John Allen Moore, no relation, bought it and erected a new store on the site. James Alexander Macaulay ran it for a few years, but it was then taken over by John W. Sharp and his wife Sally. Cicero Fidello Niece, who was nicknamed Bud, started a jewelry and watch repair business in company shops. In 1870, rented out a small portion of Sharp's store for his shop on the East Front Street section of the building. Another general store was called the Yellow Store. It was named for his bright yellow facade. Officially, it was Holt, Gant, and Holt. Originally, he was in partnership with Holt and Irwin, some of his in-laws, and located where the women's thrift shop is on Main Street today. But John Gant soon decided to get out of the store business and go into the textile business. He eventually started the Altamaha Mills and then founded Glen Raven Mills. In addition to the general stores, there were at least 2 tanneries. One was run by James G. Moore at the corner of what's now Maple Avenue and Tucker Street, where the Burlington Coffin Company was located for many years. Elias Fawcett, a black minister, opened one on East Moorhead Street. Dr. John F. Murphy started the Company Shops drugstore on Main Street next to James G. Moore's store, but he soon sold it.
Dr. Richard A. Freeman eventually bought the business a few years later and ran it for many years. The longest-lived business, however, was a combination of hardware and drugstore founded by Dr. Benjamin Abel Sellers, a name we long-term residents really know. That happened in 1872. Dr. Sellers was born and raised at the home of his father, Thomas Sellers, on Graham Hopedale Road. He studied medicine at the University of Pennsylvania and married the former Frisana Kime. He spent the Civil War years at Long's Mill, a small community near Liberty, but decided to come to Company Shops to live and open a store. His home at the corner of West Front and South Church Streets, across from Front Street from the present fire station, and his store was on West Front Street, slightly overlapping the site of Danny's Cafe. Now, it was destroyed when George Washington Holt's brick building next door caught fire in 1888, and one of the walls collapsed on it, but he soon rebuilt it as a brick structure and started branching out into other areas, especially clothing for men and women. In 1898, following Dr. Sellers' death, his son Ben erected a large 2-story brick building on Main Street, and the store survived as a well-known department store until it finally closed in 1999. And I'm proud to say I worked at Sellers Department Store, my first real job. In 1885, the Richmond and Danville Railroad was in trouble, due mostly to overextending itself too rapidly. So when a depression hit the country in 1892, it found itself in a precarious financial decision and decided to cut back where it could. One place it found it could do so without the maintenance and repair facility was Company Shops. Massive layoffs occurred, until by 1886, there was little more than a skeleton crew working in Company Shops.
For years, people living in and around Company Shops had hated the name for their small town. And in 1864, the name was actually changed to Vance. Oops, wrong way.
Yeah.
As you can see up there, Vance, North Carolina. It was named after Civil War Governor Zebulon Vance. But the North Carolina Railroad would not approve the change, and the next year it reverted back to Company Shops again. By the early 1880s, the nation's railroads were viewed by most people, especially their underpaid and overworked employees, as oppressive and evil monopolies. And a strong union movement swept the country, even reaching here into Company Shops. Farmers, manufacturers, and other business people who used the railroads to ship their products chafed at the sky-high freight rates. So it was not surprising by early 1887, after the mass layoffs, it was decided to change the name of Company Shops to something else. A town meeting was held on February the 1st, 1887, in the large room above James Alexander, who was known as Jim Alex Holt's new store building at the corner of East Front and Main Streets. It had been erected in 1885 to replace the old building Dr. John Allen Moore had built that had been destroyed by arson on October 20th, 1884, along with most of the buildings around it. Various names were suggested, including Carolinadelphia, Holtopolis, but no one could agree. After hearing all this arguing, former slave and former town commissioner John Lane remarked that he had not heard such a fuss since the stock law requiring all livestock to be penned up had been passed a short time before, resulting in the confinement of Burlington, a tame Jersey bull belonging to Daniel Worth, which had been sent to him by his Quaker friends in Burlington, New Jersey following the Civil War to replace the area's depleted cattle herds.
Everyone's ears perked up at the name Burlington, and it was suggested as a compromise name for the town. Bill Irwin, who was the chairman of the committee to select a new name, looked in the U.S. Postal Guide to see if there was another town in North Carolina with the same name. And finding there were none, the committee agreed that it was suitable. The North Carolina legislature approved the change. Now, over the years, various stories have come out regarding the name change, but the account that it was suggested by John Lane was written down by Dr. William S. Long, Jr. He, by the way, was the son of Elon College's founder, who was at the meeting. And later that same year, Burlington got its first permanent newspaper, the Burlington News.
Its first editors were Joseph Isley, who you saw on the previous slide, and Wilbert Clapp. But Charlie Hunt, the future great-great-uncle of North Carolina Governor Jim Hunt, soon took it over and ran it for several years. Governor Hunt's great-great-grandfather, Reverend Moses Jackson Hunt, was minister of Brown's Chapel Methodist Church at the corner of Tarleton and Granville Street, and lived in a home still standing at the corner of West Davis and Central Avenue. The railroad shops were once the lifeblood of Burlington's economy, but with the massive layoffs, it looked like the little town might wither and die. One person who had faith, though, was Pete Sellers, the nephew of Dr. B.A. Sellers. Pete was a rather controversial person and something of a character. During the Civil War, he served in the Union Army, which did not exactly endear him to most people.
After the war, Pete Sellers set up a bar and eventually moved it into town at the present intersection of South Main and West Moorhead Streets, where the Times-News parking lot is today. It faced north towards the depot and was built of brick, while most buildings downtown were built of wood. Although technically illegal, the railroad and the town allowed Pete to operate his bar because, quote, something worse might come along. By the way, this photo was made when Pete was in prison for gouging a customer's eye, and it was, the location was being operated by his sister as a finishing school for girls. Pete branched out into the bar business late in his life. He first built a stable. The stable, which at the time of this photo was being operated by his son-in-law, Joe Coble, about 1900, was at the terminal end of Worth Street at the time, near the 3rd Street intersection. Then he erected a tobacco prizery for his first bar, behind his first bar, rather, near the corner of West Moorhead and Main Streets.
In fact, all of the buildings Pete built were of brick. He said it was because brick will last, and the town would last too. Unfortunately, the town tore down all of Pete's buildings, and none of them exist. When his bar was finally forced out of town in 1892, that's when Burlington formally incorporated, and they strictly enforced the provision that there would be no alcohol sold within city limits. Pete built a new one just outside the city limits where Skids 2 is located today. The bricks from his bar were used to build the Skids 2 building, and his bar at the time here, this picture was made, was known as Brown's Number 2. Lace and Alice Fowler Brown were the operators. Brown's Number 1 was located over there near Plaid Mills on Trollinger Street. It was considered one of the best eateries around, but after Lace died in the 30s, Brown's Number 2 was sold. On his property just south of downtown, as I mentioned, Pete erected the tobacco prizery, which for years has been mistakenly called his bar. And although the bar did good business, it did not add a great deal to Burlington's economy. However, a new industry came to town in 1880 in the form of the cotton factory, or textile mill. Before then, all of Alamance County's cotton mills had been water-powered, and they were located along streams and rivers like Hall River. But colder winters in the 19th century often froze these waterways, forcing the mills to close down and idle employees for as long as a month or two. Powering mills using steam boilers was not a new idea, but the presence of so many people here in company shops who were familiar with steam boilers and steam machinery due to their work on the locomotives made the town an ideal place to find skilled workers to install and maintain steam plants.
The first steam-powered cotton mill was the brainchild of Lafayette Holt and was opened in 1882. Now, he was a descendant of the German immigrant Michael Holt, but was only a distant cousin of E.M. Holt, who had founded the Alamance factory way back in 1837. Lafayette went to Massachusetts and studied modern mill design, and then came back and helped organize the construction of Lafayette Mills on what is now East Webb Avenue. Unfortunately, the mill had to close due to the nationwide depression that same year it opened, and was later bought at auction by E.M. Holt's youngest son, Lawrence, who moved to company shops and bought James G. Moore's former house on the lot, what is now East Davis Street. He renamed it Aurora Mills. Shortly before E.M. Holt's death, several of his sons moved to company shops and established 4 other cotton mills. E.M. Holt's plaid mills on what is now West Webb Avenue was the first in 1884.
By the way, Aurora Mills is being torn down. I think it's the longest deconstruction project I've ever seen. It's been 20 years and it's still not complete. Aurora was soon followed by Elmira Mills across the railroad tracks, then Windsor Mills, and then Lakeside Mills, finally in 1893. Pictured here is the Windsor Mills still standing on Gilmer Street. Before long, the mills were employing more people than the railroad shops ever did, and many former farmers began to move to Burlington to find work. It's estimated that no fewer than 2/3 of all workers in Alamance County worked for one of the cotton mills. The pay was low, the work was hard, the working conditions were terrible. But often whole families worked there at the same time so they could at least count on a steady income. The only citizens of Burlington left out during the rise of the cotton mills were its black residents, since the mills refused to hire them.
Although the cotton mills soon became the lifeblood of Burlington's economy, several entrepreneurial citizens brought knitting equipment in and soon began making socks. The capital investment required to establish a hosiery mill was much less than required for a cotton mill, and the machines could be installed in smaller spaces. Pretty soon, hosiery mills started popping up all over Burlington. 2 of the most successful manufacturers were the brothers Ben and Will May. They started off selling fruit trees and traveled throughout the Southeast doing so. Then they started selling socks. Seeing more profit in hosiery than in fruit trees, they soon decided to start their own hosiery mill in Burlington. Burlington's 3rd big manufacturing industry was coffins. For years, coffins were made by local carpenters, but Locke Irwin and his brother-in-law, Tom Moore, decided to mass produce them, beginning in January of 1886. They acquired the site of James G. Moore's old tannery at the corner of Maple Avenue and Tucker Streets and established the Carolina Coffin Company, which soon changed its name to Burlington Coffin Company.
As activity at the railroad's maintenance and repair shops began to slow, the North Carolina Railroad saw no need to retain the land surrounding them and began to sell it off, with the process being virtually complete by the time company shops became Burlington. A fire set by an arsonist in the restaurant of Tom Duck, a black man, on October 20th, 1884, destroyed all of the buildings on East Front Street and half of those on the east side of the 300 block of Main Street. By the way, Tom Duck's saloon, or restaurant, was located where Smitty's is today. 2 other fires, one in 1888 and another in 1890, were also believed to have been set by an arsonist, and they destroyed most of what was left of Burlington's downtown. By 1891, there were several new brick buildings being erected on the south side of Front Street, the north side of Davis Street, and along both sides of the 300 block of Main. Among those still standing today are half of Jim Alex Holt's store at the corner of Main and Front Street, where the corner portion was torn down 2 or 3 years ago. Columbus Townsend, who was the second mayor of Burlington, his business and farm implement store at the corner of West Davis and Worth Street still standing. It was most recently a Subway store and it's now condemned. Bud Neese's jewelry store at the corner of Main and West Davis Streets, and Charles F. Rawhut's store at the corner of Spring and East Front Streets, directly across from the Paramount. In 1890, Will Turrentine, who was the engineer who took General Johnston down to meet Sherman, Will Turrentine grew up in the old O'Neill plantation. He lived just at the corner of Edgewood Avenue and Tarleton Avenue, and he's the one that suggested the name for Tarleton Avenue. He was an historian himself, but unfortunately most of what he wrote down did not survive. Anyway, Will built a building next to the Bud Neese jewelry store that housed Romulus R. Moore's racket store, and that's, you can see the name up there announcing its building. Racket store was an early name for a discount store, kind of like a dollar store is today, or a dime store was 60 or more years ago. However, R.R. Moore wasn't in business for very long, but the building is still there and still houses a church. The pile of dirt you see next to it is the excavation for a store built a year later by Banks Holt, one of E.M. Holt's sons. It later became Kirk Holt Hardware, and has most recently been the Treasure House.
The area on both sides of Main Street below Davis Street became dominated by livery stables and tobacco warehouses. It was called Chinchtown, after the smelly bug of that name, due to the odor. Burlington's best known and most prosperous liveryman at the time was Henry G. Kime. His stable was located on South Main, where the Capital Bank is today. Now, Henry was a poor man from Kinesville when he came to Burlington, while it was still company shops, but he became very wealthy as a horse and mule trader. He used to ride a buggy around throwing nickels to children he would see playing in the streets. Thanks to all the new cotton mills, Burlington's economy got off to a good start. Among the new businesses were the Holt & May Hardware, which opened in 1891 in the old Turrentine building next to C.F. Neese's jewelry store. And as was mentioned, later known as the Kirk Holt Hardware, it expanded to the Banks Holt store building next door, most recently the Treasure House, and then to West Davis Street behind the Neese building.
Another new store, originally located on Main Street, where Main Street Vinyl is today, was the Foster Shoe Company. It was in operation for more than 100 years. Burlington also saw its first 2 department stores towards the end of the 19th century. The first was and shown here is the Isley Brothers store located on Main Street. It was owned by brothers Joe and Christian Isley. It started out small, but by the end of the century, it had grown into a massive 2-story building that went through the block from Main to Worth Streets. And as mentioned earlier, too, in 1898, Dr. B.A. Sellers' oldest son, Ben, bought an empty lot on the side of Main Street opposite the Isley store, and there erected this 2-story brick building and turned his father's former drug and hardware store into a modern department store that rivaled the Isley Brothers in size. The two were competitors until the Isley store failed at the beginning of 1918. Sellers, on the other hand, lasted until 1999, when it finally closed its doors for good. But growth slowed during the rest of the 1890s due to another depression called the Cleveland Panic that started in 1892. It wasn't until after the Spanish-American War in 1898 that things began to grow again. Unfortunately, at that same time, 2 very ugly things happened that have been ignored or glossed over since then.
First was the rise of white supremacy. During the 1890s, the Republican Party attracted large numbers of poor white voters throughout the South by addressing issues important to them. North Carolina even elected its first Republican governor since William W. Holden. That occurred in 1896. His name was Dan Russell. The Southern Democrats responded by using race as the issue to bring poor white voters back into the fold. The late 19th century was an era in which social Darwinism was rampant. That is, the belief that certain races were superior to others. It was in full vigor and in vogue at that time. To many, it appeared that the whites of the Western European descent were the predominant race because nations such as Britain, France, and Germany were able to conquer and colonize so much of the rest of the world with relative ease, and nearly all of the technological developments originated in those countries. Those of African descent in the United States were unfortunately portrayed as little more than savages with animal instincts fit only for manual labor.
This was emphasized locally by a series of high-profile rapes attributed to young black men against white women, the most publicized being that of Bob Matkins, pictured here, who was charged, convicted, and hanged for that crime in 1901, although many people believed he was not guilty. But once they had attracted a sufficient number of white voters, the Democrats further diluted the Republican Party's voter rolls by disenfranchising black voting rights. This was followed by a series of laws to segregate the white and black races from each other and to further emphasize the inferiority of the latter. In Burlington, where black and white businesses once coexisted side by side, black businesses were relegated to an area along Worth Street, west of Main Street and south of Moorhead Street, which became known as Black Bottom. Second was the rise of the labor movement. While the cotton mills were the savior of Burlington's economy, the employees were poorly paid, averaging only about $5 a week. They were overworked and harshly treated by their cruel supervisors. A 66-hour work week was normal in 1886. That was down from 72 hours in 1882. And there were no benefits, no paid sick days, no paid vacation days, and no breaks, except a 30-minute period for lunch, which was not paid. Sundays were the only days off, but work did stop at 3 p.m. on Saturdays so people could get ready for church the next day.
Many mill workers could not afford their own homes, so they lived in houses constructed by the mills and paid exorbitant rent. They bought their food and supplies from mill-owned stores and paid high prices there. More than a few found themselves in debt to the mills. The mills worked young children, and many were assigned to highly dangerous jobs, such as cleaning the lint from beneath the machinery while it was still running. These kids were called dust monkeys. Several were maimed or killed during this type of work. A massive strike against the cotton mills took place in the fall of 1900. It began on September 25th and lasted until about mid-November. At least 5,000 of the 8,000 mill employees walked off the job. The Holts responded by shutting down all of the mills. Now, the timing of the strike was poor, since the Holt mills had enough product in storage to weather a long strike, but the workers couldn't afford a long strike. The National Union of Textile Workers didn't have the funds to pay the strikers, and most of them had no savings. Pretty soon, the Holts started evicting strikers from their mill-owned homes. They also announced that the mills would reopen on October 15th, but they would no longer employ union labor.
In the end, nearly all the strikers gave up and went back to work. Once cold weather started setting in during the first weeks of November, they pretty much all went back to work. The Holts had won, but at a heavy price to their local prestige. There was a great deal of sympathy for the strikers, and even newspapers like the Alamance Gleaner that had formerly supported the Holts turned against them. Except for Bob Holt, one of James Henry Holt Sr.'s sons, who ran the mill at Glencoe, and Eugene Holt, who ran Aurora Mills. They both cared about their employees and did a great deal to improve working conditions at their mills. But the rest of the Holt family became one of the most hated in Burlington. Although they successfully covered up all mention of the 1900 strike in any subsequent history of Burlington, most people had long memories of it, and the whole name was tarnished for years to come.
But shortly after the new century began, Burlington entered a boom era that would last until 1928. Now, the following shows the transformation of Main Street in only 5 years. And then, only 15 years later, in 1920. Notice the bigger, better Burlington sign. Here's a close-up. Now, many people think Easy Jones and WBBB radio started it, but no, the sign was erected in 1914 and remained there until it just fell apart in 1934. It was visible to every passenger train coming into Burlington. The phrase was attributed to John Monroe Cook, who ended every speech with, "Let's all work together to build a bigger, better Burlington." The phrase was used on all city license plates until about 40 years ago, when they were no longer required. No period in the city's history has ever seen so much progress and construction and so many improvements in the city's infrastructure. Remarkably, most of it was due to a handful of progressive individuals who planned ahead, looked to the future, took great risks, and ignored the naysayers.
One of these men was Mayor Archippus Floyd Barrett, known as Chip. He was a partner in the Freeman Drug Store and served as mayor from 1905 to 10 and encouraged many civic improvements. Burlington had a small police force shortly after the name was changed, Frank Paler being the first chief of police. He ran a harness shop right across the street. But it was not until 1902 that Burlington organized its volunteer firemen into what could be deemed a professional organization. Hydrants were added along Main Street, with a water source being the railroad's reservoir, which is now City Park. For everyday purposes, downtown Burlington merchants and residents depended on a community well at the corner of East Front and Main, right in front of what used to be Mary Catherine's. But an outbreak of typhoid in 1904 caused the city to dig a new deep well and install water and sewer pipes for indoor plumbing. This city also received a modern telephone service from Southern Bell, replacing a mom-and-pop operation that had been in existence for about 5 years. The city also built a modern electric plant on Hawkins Street to provide electrical service to the downtown area for the first time.
A streetcar system began operating in October 1911, connecting Burlington to Graham and eventually to Haw River. It also built a car barn on Rainey Street near Beaumont Avenue's intersection, and for the next 12 years, this system was used by nearly everyone as their primary means of inter- and intra-city travel. A modern new depot was erected by Southern Railway to replace the small wooden one erected in 1893 and destroyed by fire along with the Railroad Hotel in 1904. Although there's a brass plaque located on the front of the building, 1892 for some strange reason. Passengers debarking the depot only had to walk a few feet to catch a streetcar to travel all over town.
When the Railroad Hotel was destroyed, Mrs. Jenny Bett Ward, who had been the Railroad Hotel's last manager, erected the Ward Hotel at the corner of Church Street and Andrews Avenue, which was later West Webb Avenue. This portion you see here, the wooden portion, was torn down in 1938 and replaced by a gas station, but operations continued out of the brick annex built behind it until 1972, when her daughter Betty Van Ward died. Some magnificent homes were erected in Burlington during the latter part of the 19th century and the first decade of the 20th. Most of them are gone now, but here are just a few. This first one is Irwin Holt's house. It's where the municipal building is today. This is Little Lawrence. He was Lawrence S. Holt Jr., but everyone called him Little Lawrence. This home was very close to the corner of Spring Street and East Davis Street, about where Croson Insurance is today. This is Finley Williamson's house. The First Presbyterian Church sits on the site today. When Finley went bankrupt, his home was purchased by Will May of the hosiery, May Hosiery. But after Will's death in 1954, he sold the house and it was torn down to build First Pres. This next house, this is
Kirk Holt, I believe.
Yeah, it's Kirk Holt's house. It's where it's at the corner of South Mebane and Webb Avenue. Later, it was torn down and a Winn-Dixie store was built on the site. It's the building itself that replaced the Kirk Holt house is still standing today. This next building is Blythewood. This was Lawrence Holt's house. It's set in the middle of what's now Lexington Avenue, right in front of the municipal building. This is Bonnie Oaks. This was John Gant's house. It's set right in the middle of East Front Street, a block away from here. Next is the Jim Holt house. This house is notable. It's now the Burlington School is now on the site. After Jim's death, it was turned over to the local Blessed Sacrament Catholic Church and was used by them as both a church and a school and several other uses until it was finally demolished in 1971. The most interesting thing about this house is that it was the site of the only concert by the famous Von Trapp family here in Burlington, which took place in November 1941. The Von Trapps had come here to play sing at Elon's Whitley Auditorium, and they stayed at Alamance Hotel, which is still standing down on Main Street. But before they left, they decided to go to Mass at Blessed Sacrament, and then when they emerged, they were asked to do an impromptu concert, which they complied with. So that is where they performed. Now this next building here, in 1901, Burlington organized its first graded school. It formerly had a bunch of small private schools that encompassed students in one room, all different grades. I mean, there were no real grades at the time. They were of all different levels. It was an unwieldy system, but actually, the town of Elon College had a graded school 5 years before Burlington ever did. But in 1901, the city decided to buy the old Methodist Academy, which was located on Broad Street at the time, on the site of the old campground where the Union soldiers had buried the gold. And they used some of the existing buildings that were on the Methodist Academy property as the school buildings, and then erected some new ones. As the population grew, however, so many wooden buildings were added that the school became known as the Chicken Coop School. Now, the automobile came to Burlington about the middle of the first decade. It's believed that Charlie Sellers, a local photographer and the son of Dr. B.A. Sellers, had the first car. It was a 1904 Maxwell. It was a bright red car, and people recall it racing up and down Front Street here, most of the time struggling to get up that little hill past Main Street, and they nicknamed it the Red Devil because it made so much noise. Charlie later started the city's first automobile dealership in 1909, but he quickly grew bored with it and found out it was taking up too much of his time, so he sold it to his friend Luke Atwater, who established what became known in 1953 as Atwater Ford.
Burlington received its first movie theater, the Grotto, at what is now 412 South Main Street, exactly 110 years ago this month. Over the next 21 years, ending with the State Theater on West Webb Avenue in 1938, several movie theaters opened downtown, but none after the State was constructed. The next new movie theater in Burlington was the Park Theater in Mason's Plaza during Christmas 1966, nearly 30 years later. This theater, the one we're sitting in, was constructed in 1928 and opened as the Grand Theater in mid-December by Judge Ruffin Qualls. And give you a little hint, next year we will be celebrating the 20th anniversary of the renovation and restoration of the Paramount and the 90th anniversary of the opening of this building. There's a lot to look forward to. watch this space. Now, this theater was financed by William Kirkpatrick, or Kirk Holt, one of the founders of the Holt May Hardware in 1891. He was also the president of Alamance Insurance and Real Estate. Burlington erected its first buildings to exceed 2 stories during the first decade of the 20th century. The first was the Troxler Building, opened in 1907. That's still standing on East Davis Street. The second was First National Bank Building, erected in 1909 at the corner of Main and Front.
The first 2 decades of the 20th century also saw the arrival of many new citizens, some of whom were immigrants from Eastern Europe, the Middle East, Greece, and China. Many Greek immigrants later opened restaurants. The first was Nick Sacrenti, who opened the New York Weenie Stand on Main Street in 1919. The Alamance Hot Weenie Lunch, pictured here, was opened by Zacharias John Touloupas in 1928, and it was the 3rd Greek restaurant after New York Weenie Stand and Atlanta Hot Weenie Stand. And it's the oldest still in continued operation, although it's now called Zach's. Jews started coming to Burlington around the turn of the century. The first 2 known Jewish merchants were brothers Ike and Max Harris. They operated a clothing store over here at the corner of East Front and Main Street around 1904. It's the part of the Burlington Brew Works that they tore down. That was known as Harris's on the Corner. Now, most of those from Eastern Europe were Jews from Russia, seeking to escape the Tsar's pogroms. Among the many Jews who became well-known businessmen in Burlington were brothers Saul and Meyer Levine, Hyman Fleischman, Benjamin Goodman, Abe Goodis, Isidore Goldman, and Isidore Mazur. Now, the Corey family came from Lebanon, and they opened a dress shop in the 400 block of Main Street. Carl Berg came from Norway and opened Berg's Bakery across East Front Street from this theater where the vacant lot is today. Carl later built a new bakery down at the next corner when that portion of East Front Street was opened. It's still standing there on the corner, but unfortunately Carl died before he was able to run it for very long. And it later became Bambi Bakery, if some of you remember that. Now, pictured here in the buggy, this is Sing Lee. He came along with several of his relatives from China in 1898 to escape punishment from the Dowager Empress. He entered the country illegally through Canada and made his way to Burlington, where he opened a laundry at the corner of Spring and East Davis Streets, where May Memorial Library is today.
By the time the second decade of the 20th century rolled around, the Holt mills were on their last legs. By then, they were being operated by E.M. Holt's grandchildren, who neglected improving them by adding such changes as more efficient machinery and switching their product line from cotton to new artificial fabrics, such as rayon. It wasn't long before the Holt mills were losing market share to mills in other cities in North Carolina that adopted these improvements, and they began to lose money. By 1920, they were barely hanging on. By the time Burlington, the economy, however, was being fueled by hosiery mills. Brothers Ben and Will May, who owned May Hosiery Mills, located at the corner of East Moorhead and Main Streets, dominated the hosiery industry in the city.
Earl Baines Horner, native of Person County, came to Burlington in 1904, nearly penniless. He began working for the Virginia Bridge and Iron Company in the old railroad shop buildings and took a correspondence course in engineering. In 1919, he was elected mayor and won every re-election until his untimely death in 1944. He was not only the longest-serving mayor in Burlington's history, he was also the most powerful and most controversial, although most people from that era have said he was the best and most effective mayor of all. Now, Mayor Horner was one of those individuals who did things and sought approval after the fact. One of his first acts was to open Main Street north of the railroad tracks so that downtown Burlington could expand in that direction. In order to do so, he first had to clear the ruins of the old shop buildings that were blocking Main Street, and they had burned in June 1918 in a huge fire. Now, this he did during the early morning hours of October the 29th, 1919, when he authorized the city to blow them up with dynamite. Now, Southern Railway, who owned the buildings at the time, had Mayor Horner arrested, but they agreed not to press any charges when Bob Holt, the owner of Glencoe Mills, posted the mayor's bond and offered to pay for his defense. As Bob allegedly told the Southern officials, he said, "I got more money than Southern Railroad." He said, "Let's see who goes bankrupt first." And it just wasn't worth it for Southern to argue over a pile of rubble, so they just sold the property. The rubble was cleared off the Main Street right-of-way. The depot, which has the date 1892, but actually dates from July 1904 on it, it was moved from its site blocking Main Street over to the old railroad hotel site, and North Main Street was opened. Although there was a big gap in the old carpenter shop, the eastern half was bricked over and turned into what's still standing as the Standard Building, and the western half was renovated into two smaller store buildings.
Mayor Horner's next project was to dam Stony Creek and create a reservoir to supply Burlington with all of its water needs into the distant future. Now, people condemned the reservoir as an unnecessary extravagance, but it served its purpose for 30 years until a drought forced the city to build an even larger reservoir, Lake Camac. Mayor Horner also led the efforts to improve city services, and he lavished city funds on both police and fire departments. For the first time in history, the city had fire trucks. He motorized the police department in the 1930s, starting out with motorcycles and then adding police cruisers.
The year 1916 was a big one from Burlington. A new city hall, the first one in Burlington's history to be owned by the city, was completed that year. It served until it was demolished in 1970 after the present municipal building had opened. It was also the year Burlington finally began to pave its downtown streets, although concrete sidewalks had been installed in 1911. Also, Burlington's first hospital, Rainey Hospital, opened on Rainey Street that year. Its first surgeon was Dr. Rainey Parker, who just happened to have the same first name as the street and the hospital. And although most people today even think it was named for him, but it wasn't. Finally, in 1916, Burlington erected a new brick school building on Broad Street to replace the old chicken coop school. Boy, that's hard to say. And when it was completed, it was the largest in the state. But it soon became overcrowded that by 1921, two new brick school buildings, Maple Avenue and Fisher Street, had to be opened. Only 2 years later, a third, Hillcrest, was constructed. The old Broad Street building then became known as Burlington High School, and later it was known as Broad Street Junior High School before it was demolished.
Department stores and chain grocery stores first came to Burlington just after World War I ended. The first grocery stores were A&P and Piggly Wiggly. The two department stores were Belk Stevens and Effords. Although sellers handled the new competition well, the Isley brothers went bankrupt at the beginning of 1918 and closed their department store, as we mentioned earlier. The building was acquired by Marvin B. Smith for his furniture store that summer, but on the morning of December 17, 1918, it caught fire and nearly destroyed the entire block. The year 1918 also saw two other devastating fires in Burlington. In January, the large Williamson wholesale house on West Davis Street was destroyed, and in June, the old railroad shops were destroyed.
Now, this view here shows Main Street, this was in 1934. And you can see that Main Street is open by the track. Where this fellow was crossing the road, this is where the old depot was moved to from its railroad hotel site to this site to close Main Street about in 1977. Here you see the Carolina Theater, which used to be on Main Street. It's best known as where the Three Stooges made two personal appearances here. So it's, you know, holy ground over there. The Lyric Theater is right over here. The Lyric Theater, which closed in 1934 when this picture was made, it was the site of a murder in 1928 where one fellow who had been having an affair with another fellow's wife came out of the theater, and the husband was walking into the theater. Both reached for their pistols at the same time, but the fellow coming out of the theater was outdrawn and killed. Now this next slide is of significance to me because we mentioned that Kirk Holt had put up, who was president of Alamance Insurance and Real Estate Company, put up the money for the Paramount Theater. He was the president. Walter Sharp was vice president. Jessie Cook, the wife of John Monroe Cook, who had the Bigger, Better Burlington addition to his speech, was secretary, and my grandmother, Stella Huffine, was the treasurer of this company. That's her office window right there, and that's her Dodge, parked right out in front. This building was erected in 1908 as the headquarters for Atlantic Bank and Trust Company, with Alamance Insurance being over the top of it. In 1928, unfortunately, the Central Loan and Trust Company failed, which brought down every other real estate and financial institution in Burlington. In other words, the Depression hit here before it hit anywhere else. And the banks closed. First National Bank that you saw on an earlier slide was closed. And Alamance Insurance and Real Estate also closed as well. This building was later taken over by the Rayless Department Store and was utilized by them for many years until it was finally torn down in 1973. The last big building built before the Great Depression hit Burlington was the Atlantic Bank and Trust Company that was on the ground floor here. Was getting so big, it built a new skyscraper catacornered across on the next block at the corner of Main and East Davis, but while it was Burlington's first skyscraper, a 10-story building. But while it was under construction, Atlantic Bank and Trust Company went under, and the bank that bought it out had to plaster over the name that had already been engraved into the granite. You can still see Atlantic Bank and Trust Company now, but they had to remove several other signs over that before when they restored the building. It was Burlington's really last big construction project for many, many years. Between 1935 and the outbreak of World War II, the only major construction projects, and this is kind of hard to see with my reading glasses on now, I should have realized this, was the new federal building, which is now a LabCorp building at the corner of Maple Avenue and Spring Street. The new Sears store, which is now part of May Memorial Library. It was the corner of East Front and Spring Street. There were also a few stores erected along the section of East Front Street between Lexington Avenue and Spring Street that had been open following the deaths of John and Karina Gant. Their beautiful home you saw earlier, Bonnie Oaks, once sat in the middle of the street. It was later moved down to where Occasions is now, but then when the Occasions building was built as a grocery store, they tore it down.
One of the most shocking events of the decade was the murder of Alamance County's new sheriff, Marcellus P. Robertson, a former Burlington police officer, and veteran police officer Sonny Vaughn. This took place in the early morning hours of December 7th, 1938. Sheriff Robertson had gone to the Burlington Police Station, then located on Andrews Avenue on the first floor of City Hall, to tell his former colleagues about his first day as sheriff. While he was there, someone stopped by the station and reported that there was a burglary taking place at the Sprinkles service station at the corner of North Church and Trade Streets. Officers Vaughn and Bailiff went to investigate, and Sheriff Robertson tagged along. They had just gotten out of their car and were walking to the station when they were shot from inside. Both died on the scene. Officer Bailiff then fired through the window and killed the burglar who had fired the shots.
During the first 3 decades of the 20th century, Burlington grew from a sleepy little village into one of North Carolina's 10 largest cities. The Great Depression put the brakes on further growth as it did nationwide, and while things improved during World War II, shortages of building materials and during, immediately, and after the war prevented any real growth. Burlington's economy boomed following the end of World War II, however, and was further boosted by the addition of Western Electric on Graham Hopedale Road. Western Electric made components for U.S. missiles and paid high wages, which brought a lot of skilled engineers to Burlington, many from the northern states. Unfortunately, the anti-ballistic missile treaty with the Soviet Union in 1968 caused orders from Western Electric to dry up. Burlington Industries, which had been created in 1923 from the bankrupted Holt cotton mills, Burlington Industries was created by J. Spencer Love from Gastonia, and all of the old cotton mills were turned into mills for making fabrics out of the new artificial fibers like a rayon. Now, these mills were so successful in the 30s and 40s and 50s that practically anyone that wanted a mill job could get one. And it was and Burlington Industries was the dominant business in the Burlington area. But by the 1960s, the arrival of cheaper imports from places like Japan and Indonesia and India and China, they made Burlington Industries non-competitive.
By the beginning of the 1970s, Burlington's economy had stagnated and downtown was all but dead. An ill-advised downtown renewal project, which began with a vast influx of government funds, resulted in the demolition of more than half of the old buildings downtown. Here's another view of Burlington about 1940 before the massive demolition started in the early 70s. Now, those along West Webb Avenue disappeared entirely, and the street was straightened and widened to occupy their former sites. Most of the buildings along Worth Street and West Front Street were also demolished, along with many in the 400 and 500 blocks of North Main.
Black Bottom disappeared entirely. Plans had been made to demolish most of what was left downtown, but fortunately, government funds dried up and the destruction was stopped right before this Paramount Theater was supposed to have been torn down. Among the buildings, this was among the buildings granted a reprieve. The Qualls family that had started this theater as the Grand in 1928 tried to revive it as a movie theater between 1971 and 75, but they were unsuccessful. It was then turned over to the Gallery Players, who turned it into a successful stage theater for the next 20 years before the building was eventually renovated by the city, and it is what it is today. In 1977, an effort was made to transform what was left of downtown into a pedestrian shopping mall. Main Street was finally closed after 56 years, and the 1904 depot, not the 1892 one, that burned. Since that had fallen into disrepair since Southern discontinued passenger service in 1962, it was moved to the middle of the old 200 block of Main Street to serve as the focal point of the new mall. The 300 and 400 blocks of Main Street were closed to traffic, paved over, the pavement replaced by brick. But the mall concept failed completely. No one wanted to walk to stores that they had previously parked in front of them.
By the end of the 20th century, even Sellers had finally closed after 127 years of operation. It seemed like the only reason people came downtown was to pay bills at City Hall, go to the library, or visit Zach's or Stavros Grill or a Boston Sandwich Shop. However, LabCorp soon moved to town and acquired many of the remaining larger buildings for its operations. While it saved most of the buildings by repairing and renovating, it didn't really contribute to the revitalization of downtown businesses. For the past 25 years, downtown has seen many small businesses come and go, but none of them, either alone or collectively, had succeeded in drawing the large numbers of people downtown. Except for special events like the Christmas parade, the Dickens Christmas, and the Fourth Fridays, relatively few people came downtown, and nights, sometimes the streets were practically deserted. Now, some of that changed when the Paramount Theater was reopened, and those were weekend events, drawing sometimes 1,000 people in a weekend, but mostly when shows were being performed by local theater groups. However, the beginning of the 21st century saw Burlington continue to grow towards the west to the point where now parts of the city limits extend into Guilford County. The only growth which is dominated by non-locally owned businesses has been almost exclusively along the I-85, I-40 corridor. A lot of high-paying jobs are found in the adjoining counties, so Burlington has become sort of a bedroom community where people work in other areas or work in chain retail stores or chain restaurants.
In its 161-year existence, Burlington has faced many challenges and difficulties, and thanks to the efforts of a handful of progressive people who have always looked to the future, it has always met those challenges. Right now, progress is being made to bring high-paying jobs to our city, and efforts are being made to make downtown vibrant and the place that people want to be once again. So, as John Monroe Cook would say, here's to a bigger, better Burlington.
Moment to bring the house lights up, guys.
Oh, I don't look good under the lights, or even in the dark.
There we go. And we thank our friends with the City of Burlington, the City Council, and the Recreation Commission for their continuing support, keeping this building alive. Hopefully we'll be around for another 90 years or so, we hope. But thank you so much for coming out tonight.